Morning, everyone, and welcome to our town hall meeting. We're so pleased to have you join us and appreciate everyone who's been able to log in. It is just a little bit after 10, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We know that there's been a lot of questions about some of the vaccine safety in light of some of the announcements with regard to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And so we wanted to set up a town hall and have a chance to hear from some of our experts who've joined us previously, talk a little bit about where we're at with regard to vaccine administration, which, you know, while we're doing good in terms of across the country and the state, we also know that we've still got some opportunities to be able to help increase our vaccination rates and get more people vaccinated. That way, hopefully, we can start to get back to doing the things that we want to do and be able to keep our case rate down where it needs to be. So we have Dr. Greenfield, who you may recall had joined us previously, who is with us today. He's graciously agreed to join us from the health department. He's a practicing OBGYN, in addition to being the Arkansas section chair for the American Congress of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and currently serves as the health department's medical director for family health. So we'll also be having Dr. Tumlison, who will also be joining us via Zoom in a little bit. Dr. Tumlison is also with the health department, and he's the head of outbreak response and immunizations, and he'll be joining us via Zoom. So with that, we're going to go ahead and go through some questions, and then we'll save some time towards the end. So hopefully folks who are participating, you can go ahead and type your questions into the Zoom, and then we'll try to answer as many of those as we can.
You want to kick? Well, so Dr. Greenfield, I'll start with the questions. You're a practicing OB. So what do you tell your patients, especially those who are pregnant or wanting to get pregnant, about being vaccinated?
So that's a very unique and special population. And there's not a single answer for each individual patient. Quite often it's very specific in the sense that we're addressing a pregnancy concern. But how we answer the question is obviously tailored to that individual's experience, their concerns, and we start there. So, you know, we start with the background of that the pandemic. We reinforce the fact that this is a very real concern and that pregnant women have, with that condition, certain risk factors that are different than their non-pregnant counterparts. Pregnant women have an increased risk of preterm delivery. Pregnant women who become sick with COVID-19 have a more severe course, and older pregnant women would even have potentially a more severe course than their non-pregnant counterparts. So we start with that. And then we move to the real question is, should I get the vaccine, yes or no? That really is sort of the binary question. And I give information based on what our bodies in OBGYN, who they are, and what their guidances are. And there are really three guidances that we frequently refer to. One is from the CDC, one is from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the other is from the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. And in each of these cases, there's an acknowledgement that women were not included in the large original trials of the vaccine. So we're somewhat limited in that information. And in each of these groups, the consensus statements can be condensed to say that the vaccine should be available for each of these women if they're pregnant, given the consideration of what would be the risk if they were to contract the disease. Now, again, it still feels like I've evaded the question, should I get the vaccine, yes or no? Yeah. But we have to sort of start with that because it tells us that there's somewhat limited information and we have to make a very personal decision. In my practice, once we go through that, then we come to a sort of a shared decision-making process. Does the vaccine appear to be safe? Have pregnant women received the vaccine? Millions of doses have been given, and it does appear to be safe. But what are the long-term implications? That we're still learning. Yeah. So I tend to recommend it and advise it, but I certainly respect the considerations that individuals may have, and I have to couch it with the fact that when we look at what the governing bodies say and what their recommendations are, there are some limitations. Yeah. But you do not have to have a pregnancy test prior to receiving the vaccine. If you are pregnant, you do not have to have a doctor's permission note to receive the vaccine. Those are the things that are important. So if you are pregnant and you want it, it should be made available to you.
And that's a really good point. And Dr. Greenfield, I probably should have led off by saying, you know, we really did want you here today, specifically because DHS is an agency that is primarily, there's a majority of women that work for our agency. And also there's a lot of young women who have been expressing those concerns, and we've heard them. So we appreciate you being able to speak on that. One of the questions that we have equally received is whether or not you have seen any patients that have had babies since they got vaccinated. And if so, how has the health of that baby been?
So I have not had a patient, well, you have to think the vaccines were
Right.
just available in December. Those were the first ones came out, and then they were limited to people who were in special populations based on employment and what level, what phase they were actually in, and now more generally available. So we are seeing them more. So I will start the answer this way. Yes, I have had patients who are pregnant who have received the vaccine. Okay, it's a routine part of questioning. I have not personally had a patient who has delivered after having had received the vaccine. So I can't speak to where we are in terms of the observations of those effects. I can tell you that in the state of Arkansas, we are developing a registry to monitor moms who have contracted COVID and who are pregnant. And we will follow, and I work to identify those moms and those babies to follow the long-term effects. But to the specific of the vaccine, that we haven't had. Now, that has been done in other places, and there have been places and studies that have shown that moms who have received the vaccine, in fact, may convey antibodies to the newborn. And you think in many ways that's particularly important and interesting, and it'll be interesting to follow what that impact is, because right now the vaccines are limited to those individuals who are 16 years of age and older. So a newborn would not be a candidate for a vaccine at this time.
All right, thank you, Dr. Greenfield. Has Dr. Tumlison joined us yet? Okay, great. Well, then we'll go forward with some other questions, Dr. Greenfield, if you don't mind, just to explain a little bit about what's happening with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I know there's been a lot of
Sure.
Press out there. I think people concerned about what exactly is it that people are saying, kind of what does that mean now that the
Sure.
FDA has taken a pause. So we'd appreciate if you could just talk about both the situation, but also then whether or not it's still safe to continue
Sure.
getting the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine.
Absolutely. So we'll start. There are 3 vaccines that are currently available to the general public, and 1 is currently on hold. The first that came out was Pfizer, which is a 2-shot series. The second is Moderna, which is a 2-shot series. And those 2 vaccinations work on the same technology. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a different technology than the 2 previous ones that I mentioned. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, over 6 million doses have been given, and there were reported 6 cases of blood clot formation and platelet abnormalities in a few patients. So 6 patients out of 6 million. And that has led to a cautious pause of administration of that vaccine. And that recommendation came out yesterday. So that's what we know in terms of numbers. Now, that's a very, very small number out of the number of people who've actually received the vaccine. So I think we have to follow the science to see what this will actually mean. How it can impact us in terms of our concern for vaccine administration. For those who have hesitancy and concern, I think we acknowledge that's valid to have that. But I say in many ways, you have to consider that the science continues to evolve. Science isn't static. And so as we know more, as we learn more, we may change recommendations, we may change activity, just as we changed the administration of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine yesterday until we learn more. In terms of receiving the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, as I mentioned, those are different technologies, different platforms in terms of how they work, and they are still safe and available. And I still think they represent among the best path that we have out of this pandemic. So I still encourage everyone to receive the vaccines.
Great, thank you, Dr. Greenfield. It looks like we've had a couple questions.
Yeah. Sure. So I'll start with the first question that we received from staff. So many individuals are getting vaccinated. Many of our staff have gotten vaccinated, and they would like to know, how long does immunity last after the vaccine? Because I'm sure folks have started hearing kind of rumors about booster shots and things of that nature that they may have to take.
Right. So that will continue to evolve as we go forward. We know 90 days is the number that people have talked about in terms of vaccine efficacy and duration. But as we go farther out, it looks like they will have a much longer effectiveness after having received the vaccine. So the total duration, at this point, we don't know, but the trials began about a year ago, and we're seeing good effects up to this point. In terms of booster shots, I think we'll just have to see where we are. We don't really know definitively if a booster will be needed, if this will be a seasonal vaccine. I don't think we have those answers to those questions. What we can say, and which I think is in this current setting, is that they are all highly effective in preventing the things that we are most concerned about. And that is, for those people who get infected, it is highly effective in preventing severe disease and death.
Right.
So that is the take home. And so we will learn more about the overall duration.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to answer a question that we got, and then I'm going to turn it back to Dawn. So the next question we received is, what symptoms should someone who just received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine watch for?
So one of the immediate reactions that you would experience is injection site reaction. You may have redness, swelling at the site of injection, soreness, and that will be an indicator of an immediate immune response, and that's to be expected. You may have some fatigue. That would not be uncommon as well. Particularly severe, and some people, in fact, may have low-grade fever, may have a fever. So those are not unexpected. In fact, those are signs of an immune reaction. Because if you think about what we're doing, we are trying to get your body to recognize a foreign invader. And in recognition of that foreign invader, an immune response develops, characterized by redness, fever, swelling, pain. All of these things are common. If you got to a point where you are having interference with the inability to breathe, in this case with the J&J, there were folks who developed very severe headaches, evidence of blood clots, severe chest pain, shortness of breath. Those are much more severe things, exceedingly rare, but if those things were to occur, then you certainly want to call your healthcare provider.
No, thank you for that. The next question we got, and Dr. Greenfield, I'll take this one, is one of our staff members asked, is it mandatory for DHS staff to take the vaccine? This is actually a question we've gotten a couple of times as we've done the Let's Talk, and we definitely want to convey to staff that right now, all of the vaccines are still under the emergency use provision. Currently, it is not mandatory for our staff to be vaccinated, but we have always given a caveat to that and saying we cannot guarantee that somewhere down the line that the position of our agency and the position of those that that govern state government may change. But as of right now, vaccines are not mandatory for staff.
Great, thank you, Kisa. Dr. Greenfield, just to pick up a little bit on the discussion around immunity, right? So we've talked a little bit about how long does immunity potentially last with the vaccine. I think there's also lots of questions out there. If somebody's had it, do they need to get the vaccine? And discussions around herd immunity, kind of what does that mean? And what happens if we don't achieve that? Can you speak to that?
Right, so community immunity, herd immunity, these are the concepts that we have discussed for about a year now and what our ultimate goal is. And when we have community spread of an infection, in some ways we sort of lose the ability to track from person to person. We just know it's in the community and it's spreading, and it is running a pretty severe course. There have been discussions that the target would be 70% of the population vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. But the more important point is, how do we get to that point? For those who have had a diagnosis and have been infected, they may in fact have some immunity that has developed as a response to that. But the vaccine is still recommended for people even if they have been previously infected. What lies as a challenge is the fact that there are individuals in the community who will in fact contract the virus, contract the disease, and never know. And those individuals who are asymptomatic have potential to spread the disease as well, which kind of makes the point that one of our best paths to ensuring that we have a population that has developed an immune response and developed getting us toward community immunity is going to be through vaccination.
It's very important. Thank you.
All right, let's go back to the questions our staff are asking. So one of the questions was, how well are original vaccines working against the current mutations that are developing out there?
So they've been highly effective against the original strands that we've had. And there are several mutations, and I don't have all the details in terms of the numbers, in terms of efficacy, but they've been shown to be highly effective in the original strands that have been present. Now, we have seen mutations in the state, and I don't have the numbers specifically for each individual mutation that we have. We don't do that testing here. I believe that's going to the CDC for ultimate identification. But we have still seen very effective numbers in terms of protection. And I think the thing with this is what we have. There may be an ideal to have more vaccinations, and there are dozens that are in the works that are coming down the pike. But what we have right now on this day are two. And I think we have to roll with what we have.
Right, right. No, very, very true. Now, Dr. Greenfield, you may have heard this. I didn't hear this announcement, but one of our staff is asking for you to tell us about the announcement that the vaccine can cause swollen lymph nodes, which may indicate breast cancer. Okay,
so when you develop an immune response, your body will develop antibodies and a host. Let's put it this way. You develop an army to fight an invader, okay? And the lymph system is part of that network in terms of that immune response and protection. It's a filter system. So the concern that we have with the breast is that if someone receives an injection, and it's typically given in the deltoid, in the muscle at the top of the upper arm, this is in a region near the breast. And if there's an immune reaction going on and lymph nodes become inflamed after having received the injection, and that person subsequently has a mammogram in and around that time that they have received an injection to stimulate an immune response, there is a potential that an inflamed lymph node that may be present secondary to the injection may in fact look like an inflamed lymph node that may otherwise have been present due to some breast-related disease. So it would be prudent to, one, talk to your provider based on the clinical circumstances to see if the mammogram needs to be performed at a time that is removed from immediately having received the vaccine.
No, that's very good information to have. Dawn, I'm going to answer one more question that we got, and then I'm going to turn it to you because I've been advised that Dr. Tumlison has joined us. So we can potentially give Dr. Greenfield a quick break and give some questions to Dr. Tumlison. But we did get a question pertaining to vaccine clinics at the DHS offices. And I'm sure this is referencing the county offices. So we are looking at the amount of individuals who are asking for vaccines out there. Many of you all know that the Division of County Operations has actually polled staff. So has the Division of Children and Family Services related to individuals that desire vaccines that are in county offices across the state. Where we see that there's a high desire, we have tried to, coordinate. We're coordinating with the Department of Health to see if we can get clinics to you all. If there's a low number, we're trying to get you all tied to the closest clinics in your respective area. I know that we have a clinic that will soon be held this Friday at the Warren HDC, and we're definitely notifying county offices near Warren to go and take advantage of that vaccination clinic.
All right, thank you, Kisa. And just as a reminder, we have Dr. Tumlison from the Health Department who is joining us. Dr. Tumlison, thanks so much for being with us. I want to talk a little bit about what some of the studies are showing as it relates to kids and vaccinations. We've heard a lot about the impact within the adult population. We've talked some this morning about about what that looks like for individuals who may be pregnant or who are considering becoming pregnant. But really want to switch up for a bit and talk a little bit about the kids and kind of what we're seeing at this point. So would you mind sharing with us based on your experience?
I will, but unfortunately, it's a fairly brief conversation at this point. There just has not been data released yet about the studies in kids. Now, the good news is that studies are ongoing, and basically they've been done in a graduated fashion. So supposedly Pfizer is about ready to submit for approval, or they have, and the FDA is starting to consider in the age range of 12 up to 16 for Pfizer. Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are also doing similar studies kind of in the 12 up to 18 range that will hopefully be done soon. It's possible that we could have some information on whether whether the FDA and CDC will have information on whether those vaccines ought to be authorized or not in children ages 12 to 16 or 18 before the summer. So that might be happening within the next month or two. It's possible that we could be able to start vaccinating those 12 and up before the summer. Now, for younger children, Moderna has already announced, and others too, that they've started trials with their vaccines on ages down, Moderna even down to 6 months. So 6 months to 11 years as kind of a different branch of the same study. But that one's going to take a little longer because they only announced that, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, that they were getting started with that. They had been recruiting, and they're already starting the study, but it's going to take a few months to have those studies done. So for younger children, I would say I'd be happy if we were even able to start vaccinating them before the next school year in August. That would be good, but I don't know if it'll be that fast. And does that answer your questions, or was it in a different direction?
Yes, no, that's very helpful. And I think just a follow-up to that, as today the focus is, clearly on adults, but many of those adults are parents, and we'll have to be thinking about, certainly the end of the school year, but then kind of what comes this fall. And so, to your point about potentially having, vaccines available this summer that potentially folks could start getting in the fall. I mean, what advice would you have for parents about, as they're contemplating making that decision? Is it a good idea? Is it something that, we haven't seen a lot of cases necessarily in children? I mean, what would you advise?
Well, I would say, yes, I would advise it. I wouldn't say we haven't seen a lot of cases in kids, because we have. What is good is that we've not seen a lot of severe cases. Thankfully, this disease is not as severe for children in as high numbers as for age groups that go up from there. But children can still transmit the disease. They can end up with serious sequelae of it, just not as often as older people, and that's good. But still, I would say I recommend vaccinating children if and when it's approved and the CDC and FDA feels like the data on it is good enough and safe enough to authorize the vaccination of children. For instance, I have a 16-year-old daughter. I had her get vaccinated with Pfizer because it's approved, and the studies showed that it works for those age groups. And I'll remind that although it is true that young children, meaning below 10 and below, seem to transmit a little less efficiently than older children and adults, that less means they transmitted about 80% of the rate instead of 100%. So they're still very able to transmit the disease to each other, to other family members. And children 11, 12 and up really have been seen to transmit at about the same rate as adults, even if they don't get a severe disease. So that will also help us the more kids we eventually are able to get vaccinated will go toward this herd immunity, will help make schools and other places where you all work with children safer for the children and for those working there.
Excellent. And thank you so much for sharing your perspective, both as a clinician and as a parent. It's very important, as many of us will be considering what to do this fall, and really appreciate your insights.
All right. So we've got a lot more questions come through. This question is specific to DHS, and we can answer it. It says, what do I do if I lost my vaccine card gotten at the first DHS clinic? And the answer to that is that we will give you another one. So we have a record. So please, when we announce about I think Amy has already sent the follow-ups pertaining to our second vaccine clinic here in central office. Please just come down. If you don't have your card, we will provide you one. So we did get another question specifically for Dr. Tumlison. The question is, what's being done to help the homeless get vaccinated?
I'm going to let Dr. Greenfield answer that because he's even more intimately involved in that than I am.
Great.
Sure. So at the Department of Health, we have a program called Operation Compassion. And it's been up and running since the very early days of this pandemic. It began with efforts to ensure testing for the unsheltered population. And we've reached out to a number of homeless shelters and the like across the state. And we've had mechanisms to provide housing when needed for quarantine and isolation, when in fact someone who was in a congregate setting could not get back into that setting due to their diagnosis, and they were otherwise medically stable. And as we move to this phase of vaccination, we have had a number of clinics that were addressing specifically those populations. And so we've been out to several shelters across the central Arkansas region to ensure that the vaccine was available. And we've largely been using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as a single shot to ensure that they were completely vaccinated. So with the most recent announcements, we're having to hold that component of the program.
Yeah. Well, I know that's a major undertaking. So hopefully that can get back underway. While we are talking about Johnson & Johnson, since you mentioned it, one of our staff asked, could the Johnson & Johnson vaccine result in numbness in thumbs and fingers? And if so, is that a red flag?
You want to take that, Joel?
Sure, I can try. You know, I would say if that numbness in feelings is in fingers is on both sides, that's unlikely linked to the concern we have for why using that vaccine was paused. If what I really say is, yeah, in some of those people, it's caused some neurological symptoms. So look, the right answer is what we always say is, if you're worried about it, go see your doctor. But especially if that any neurological symptoms is combined with a headache that's a bad headache and just doesn't go away, those people, if they've received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine recently, I'd say that for them especially, that's a good reason to contact your doctor and go see it.
All right. So, and I might have Dawn and I tag team some of these questions that have come in, because we appreciate staff submitting them. We really do want to get your questions answered, and there are several. For either Dr. Tumlison or Dr. Greenfield, staff have asked, of the 3 vaccine options, with all that we know now, which would you all recommend and why?
Well, I would recommend the one that is most readily available to you. Vaccines alone, vaccines sitting in a vial are not the path. The vaccines that are administered, that are vaccinated, are the path. And they have been distributed and allocated based on resources that are available that we don't have total control of. And while we're in a pause period right now with the Johnson & Johnson, it just goes to show that in some cases, the future can be uncertain in terms of availability. However, I believe that the virus does not care about supply chains. So I would encourage individuals to be vaccinated when it becomes available, because they all are effective, highly effective in preventing the things that we care about, severe disease and death.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Greenfield. I'd say if, you were hoping to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or maybe you even had it set up in the next week or so, and now it's on hold, a lot of those community clinics, they're making efforts to convert them over to use either Pfizer or Moderna. I would encourage you not to delay and wait and see if, a week or 2 down the line, we can start giving the Johnson & Johnson vaccine again. But I would say, take, like you said, your first opportunity and to get either the Pfizer or Moderna in this period we're at the current moment.
Great advice. So we've talked a little bit about, where we're at in terms of, definitely, doing better with vaccines, doing better with, what we're seeing in terms of cases in the community. But we also know we've still got, it's very much still out there and active within the community. And so we've had a person ask, if they've had the virus at this point, how long would you suggest they wait before getting the vaccine?
Sam, I can answer that if you want. So honestly, there's not even a recommendation from the CDC and the Department of Health that you wait, other than make sure you're over your initial illness, meaning you got diagnosed with COVID, you got to be outside your isolation period because we don't want you going anywhere, right, while you're in that. But once you're outside of the isolation period, the advice is you can go ahead and get the vaccine. Now, there's also some language in both Department of Health and CDC stuff to say it's basically reasonable to wait up to 90 days before you want to get out, because early on, remember, we had very limited quantity of vaccine, and there were people who understandably and out of the goodness of their heart said, I've got some immunity. Why am I going to rush out and get one, 12 days after my infection? Somebody else needs that right now. And yeah, it was reasonable because from what we know, it does seem that natural immunity ought to last at least 90 days to some extent. The problem is we don't know how good that natural immunity is or how long it lasts. So CDC has kind of said, waiting 90 days, reasonable. After that, though, I wouldn't recommend you wait. So, with appointment times and whatever, I'm suggesting people, around, if they want to wait, if they don't want to just go out and get it, right after they're clear from their isolation period, I've been recommending people around 60 days after their infection, start to try and get an appointment because, sometimes you can get an appointment this week and sometimes you might have to wait a couple of weeks. So that's kind of what I've been telling people.
Excellent advice. And I think I saw or read yesterday that even though, that there has been a pause on Johnson & Johnson, there's more than enough vaccines in terms of, so to your point about, folks just want to wait, that's fine, but they can go ahead, they can, schedule an appointment because there's plenty of vaccine out there. Great. Just turning back then to the question about Johnson & Johnson again, and I realize that, the situation's still evolving. I believe the FDA is going to be doing a review to kind of understand more about the cases, but one of the questions that we received was, do we know at this point any information about underlying conditions that may have been present in the 6 people who developed blood clots?
So some of the things we know, they were all women, and they were all in an age group, I believe it was 18 to 48 or 49. The details beyond that in terms of their specific medical conditions, any other medications they may have been on, those things I don't have that information on. And I think the ACIP will be meeting, I think they have a meeting today to start asking some of the other questions, but pretty limited information at this point.
No, that makes sense. A question we received is, and I think many people have been thinking about this since the beginning of the pandemic, how do we find out if we have antibodies? Are there any studies of those with antibodies who took the vaccine regarding side effects? So it's a 2-part question.
Joel, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I would say, you can find out if you have antibodies by going to your doctor and seeing if they're willing to test you for those antibodies. What I would caution you, though, is what does it mean? Because like I said earlier, when that question about how long you ought to wait after you get infected to get vaccinated, the problem with having antibodies or some sign or having an infection is we don't know how long your immunity from that infection lasts. We don't know, there's some indications that the immunity you get from a natural infection might not be as strong or as long lasting as the immunity from the vaccination, which is weird, but it is something that happens with certain viruses, certain infections. And so what I would say is you can get your antibodies checked, but what's the utility of it? There have been some small studies in people where they, as they were going to start their vaccination with them, they tested them right at the beginning to see if they had antibodies or not. And from the ones that I've seen, the people who had antibodies and got vaccinated did not have any worse side effects than the people who didn't have antibodies and got vaccinated. Thus, even if you had an infection that you didn't know about, which was those people with antibodies, and you got vaccinated, you didn't suffer more effects from the vaccine than somebody who had not previously had an infection and got vaccinated. So it's not a recommendation to get tested, to have your antibodies checked before you get vaccination, because it looks like it's just as safe and just as effective for those who've had a prior asymptomatic infection as to those who haven't been infected at all.
Okay. That's good to know. Making sure my mic works. So I think this is, I really like this question because I've been thinking about it myself. So we're going to ask you all to kind of give us your outlook on the future. Do you think that COVID will actually go away and be eradicated? Or will this be something that, you know, stays with us where we're going to have to get annual shots like we get the flu shot?
So it's difficult to say,
Right.
to look in the future. Obviously, we don't really know. But there have been very few viruses that have been totally eradicated. Okay. Smallpox comes to mind.
Right.
And there may be a presence of low-level indolence in the community that may require vaccinations in the future. I don't think we know the answer to that. I think that we are in a position now where there was sort of the world before and the world after. I think going forward, the ability to sort of readjust in the community, just as the vaccines allow us to have an immune response, just our situational awareness of the threat of this will allow us to quickly socially distance, quickly get our masks on, and to quickly get a booster if in fact that is indeed needed. So I think as the science evolves and we know more, we will be better positioned to react to it. But I think we will certainly be starting from a position of an informed population where we were starting from a totally naive population about this disease, myself included.
Yeah, I think that's well said. You know, I would, like him, I say it's just too early to know. Another possibility is that it's not necessarily a disease that we got to get a booster for every year, but maybe at some point in the future you might need one, right? We do this with tetanus. That's a bacterial illness. That's not the same, but other viral illnesses you might need a booster for, right? We give MMR boosters, you know, to children at some point in their thing, and then if they're exposed, we give you another one later in life. So it might be that we have to give periodic boosters, or it might be, you know, we have to give yearly shots like with influenza, or maybe not at all. You know, the original SARS virus, it did just kind of disappear, right? But that wasn't because we eradicated it, just kind of went away on its own. And this virus seems a lot different from that original SARS virus in that sense. So yeah, we're going to be dealing with it. One other thing for the future, that's a lot nearer term than any of those considerations, is another wave. And the governor even kind of, you know, talked about this yesterday on the press conference. But, you know, if you ask me, I'd say we should expect another wave in the near term future, I don't know how many months, but I think it's likely to happen, right? It's already happened 3 times. And until we get a lot more of the population vaccinated, there's a good chance it's going to happen again. However, hopefully, as more people have immunity through vaccination, it won't be as bad and not as many people will suffer either illness or especially death and hospitalization.
One point you mentioned the original SARS-CoV-1. And I encourage everyone to get as much information as you can. That's how you make good decisions. That's how you make good personal decisions. And there was SARS-CoV-1 and there was MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And that one did not go away just like the COVID-1. And that one stayed at a low level and still exists in certain parts of the world. So we have some history to tell us how these viruses can perform. And I think Dr. Tumlison and I being here is fantastic. But as I tell my patients, nobody cares about your health like you do. So part of our job, if we do our job correctly, is to give you our recommendations, give you advice, help to explain the science and tell you what we know, but also to give you some resources and some things to go investigate on your own so that you know where we're coming from and help to make your own decisions as well.
Yeah, oh, that's great.
Really appreciate you both expanding on those questions, and especially Dr. Tomlinson. We're talking a little bit about booster, because I think people forget about the fact that we already have vaccines that require boosters. It's become so commonplace, and I think a helpful reminder that just because one of these COVID-19 vaccinations, may require boosters in the future, that's really fairly commonplace at this point. So definitely appreciate that. The next question we have is for Dr. Greenfield. You talked a little bit both based on what we know about the studies regarding the vaccine, as well as from your own experience treating pregnant women, sort of what the experience has been thus far for women who are currently pregnant. I think there's questions out there from individuals who have perhaps experienced infertility issues in the past. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what guidance or advice you might have for somebody who is still wanting to get pregnant, has experienced some of those issues, but also, is considering getting the vaccine.
Sure. So infertility is a devastating condition for families who are trying to start their family naturally. But to date, there's no evidence that any of the vaccines that are available have a negative impact on fertility, full stop. There are things that you may read and there are concerns that individuals may have, but at this point in time, there's no evidence that the vaccines that we have available are an impediment, and I would not avoid the vaccine for that concern.
Thank you. That's very helpful. One of the other questions we've gotten is that, now that, while we very much need to stay vigilant and be concerned about a potential fourth wave, we are seeing, people starting to travel, starting to to do some of the things that they did before the pandemic. And so one of the questions we've received is, are you all hearing or seeing anything at this point about vaccinations being required to travel or fly?
Joel, do you have any information on that specifically?
Sure, I can respond. So far, I've not heard of that, any requirement between states to require vaccination to travel from one state to another. Nor have I heard that internationally. And maybe some of that might be that it just, many nations aren't in the advantaged position we've been so far as vaccination in the United States. They just haven't been able to get even their own people vaccinated, much less to worry about other people coming in without vaccination. What right now the situation with travel is mainly internationally, but even with some, maybe some states, so you need to check out where you're going before you go. Internationally, most countries are requiring you to have a negative test within 3 days of arriving in their country and to bring the proof with you. Or you got to provide evidence of prior infection. Like, I was infected 60 days ago. Here's my doctor's note that says, yes, they have infection, they've recovered, they're fine to travel. The US government, likewise, if you go somewhere else and you return to the United States, you're going to have a test that says you're negative within 3 days. Now that can be an antigen or it can be a PCR, but you're going to have that negative test upon arrival back in the United States within 3 days of your arrival date. So that a lot of times is going to mean you're going to need to be able to get that test done wherever your destination is that you go out of the country. But so far, I've not heard of any. There may be governments that are thinking about that and planning that, but so far, I've not heard any talk of actually instituting vaccine requirements to travel, and especially within the United States. Other countries I know are discussing it more, but I've not heard of any instituting it yet.
That's very helpful. I think we have time for one more question.
Well, we actually, I know Dawn and I communicate, and then I realized we both have masks on. So we have about 10 more minutes. So we're going to try our best. There are a lot of questions in my hand. I'm going to pass them to Dawn. But if we do not get to your specific question, we will work to get answers to that and to those questions, and then we will send those out via DHS all. But here's a question for, I guess, me and Dawn. So the question is, are screenings at the offices going to end soon? So I will say this, if you look out on the shared services website, you will see the memo that pertains to the fact that the mask mandate for state employees will continue. And that is going to stay in place as we bring staff back, which all staff are required to return back to the office on May 7th, if they have not already transitioned back, those individuals that were at risk and working at home. And so we will continue to do screenings until we get indications from shared services or the governor that they are asking us to do something differently. But right now we will still continue to do screenings at the offices. And Dawn, you
I think it's May 17th, right?
May 17th, I'm sorry.
17th.
Lord, I don't want to add any, I don't want anybody panicking out there. Yes, May 17th. Thank you, Dawn. So the next question we received is, not based on the number of individuals that are getting vaccinated, is there any information out there pertaining to the survival rate or the recovery rate once individuals get COVID? Has that been updated in any manner?
Joel, do you have any information on that? Let me make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. For those, since the vaccines have been on board, has it had an influence on survival rate for people who are infected?
Yes.
Joel, do you have any information? I don't have that number.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. So if the question is, are fewer people who get sick dying from the illness, that would have less to do with vaccination, though it might have some, because we know that even if you're one of those people who has a breakthrough from vaccination, one of those, for Pfizer, 5% or whatever, that despite getting vaccinated can get ill, you're much less likely to, get sick enough to go to the hospital. So in that way, it should help, but I don't have numbers on that. I would say what we have seen so far in Arkansas is, even though we're, around not quite 25% of people in Arkansas fully vaccinated at this point, that it has helped the number of people dying in Arkansas go down. That's not exactly a rate when you start talking to, doctors, because we'd want to compare, that to the number of people who actually got sick. And I don't have that number, but it has helped the number of people dying go down.
And I'd like to elaborate on that as well. We've seen the trend go down for the past several weeks. We saw this spike after the holiday season back in January, February, and we've certainly seen the downward trend. And it was really nice to look on the board a few days ago and to see that there were no deaths and I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think we are seeing fewer people who are infected. We are seeing more immunity. We're seeing more people vaccinated. And but to that question specifically, I don't have that answer, but I do think this is all contributing to get us on the right track.
Right. So Dr. Greenfield, one of our staff members asked a question that's to the point that you just made. They would like to understand or get you all's thoughts on how you reconcile the fact that Arkansas does have a low number of people who have been vaccinated based on the information that we've been presented in the news, but also right now we have a low number of new cases of COVID. So why do you think that is?
Well, to address the number of folks who have been vaccinated, in some ways there are constraints in terms of the supply that's available. We are coming through the different phases. Now that it is widely available, I certainly would anticipate those numbers to go up. We do sort of fall toward the bottom tier of states in terms of percent of the population vaccinated. And I think when we get to issues in terms of why people aren't vaccinated, they're going to be, I like to think about them in three large buckets, if you will. And hopefully through efforts like this, we're addressing all of them. One, I would say, is for some, there is complacency. There is the idea that, I see the numbers are going down and the threat is not as real as it once was. And I think part of our job is to make sure folks aware that the threat is still very much real. I'll just share anecdotally. I talked to a very dear friend of mine yesterday who mentioned that he has a good friend who was just put on a ventilator 2 days ago. Different state, but nonetheless, that hammers home the fact that despite the fact that the numbers are going down, they are not at zero. So complacency being one, and convenience. You know, is there access? And so through efforts like this, through agencies and clinics making the vaccine available, those are two things that we can do to help to bump that number up.
Great, excellent advice. And Dr. Tomlinson, you talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think if you could just clarify, I think people, you know, as the different vaccines have been going through the approval process, and now that we have data both from since approval, but also going back to the original trials, you know, we've gotten some questions around, you know, the difference between, you know, we hear percentages like, you know, 95, 96%. Is that actually just lessening symptoms or actually providing immunity? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and it is a little confusing, and it's also confusing because between the different vaccine companies, they didn't even necessarily use the exact same language in how they framed their results. So for Pfizer and Moderna, I think you can think of it was about 94, 95% effective at preventing any illness due to COVID whatsoever. That means 5% did, but 95% effective at getting sick at all, and 100% effective at keeping people out of the hospital and dying in their studies. Likewise with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they use this weird terminology, but basically when you got down to their definition of it, they were, you know, they had different, you know, numbers for different regions where they did the testing. And I think it was around 71, 72% effective in the United States at preventing any illness at all, basically. Any illness you could notice, right? Any symptoms that were enough to bring them to your attention. It was that effective, but really, really effective, up there around 100% for preventing death and hospitalization. So that would be the way I try to simplify it for people. And when they've been studied kind of in real world situations, not an academic study, right? The numbers have been close to that. The numbers for Pfizer and Moderna, when they looked at them at different places that had really good early vaccination, like Israel, they were up above 90% preventing illness at all. And so, and likewise, the hospitalization and death has been prevented, you know, close to 100%. So that's kind of the way I've been trying to frame it in my mind and for people when I talk with them about it.
Great, that's very helpful. We've gotten a couple questions, just try to combine them together in terms of for folks who either took the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or who maybe took one of the other vaccines like Moderna and had an allergic reaction. I think just some questions about, does that mean that they actually, you know, still are, you know, have some protection, or should they instead go and try to get vaccinated again? If either of you, whoever wants to speak to that.
Sure. So once you start with one vaccine, be it Pfizer, Moderna, or the Johnson & Johnson, which, as we mentioned, is currently on hold, you should just stick with that one. Okay. When we talk about the efficacy, which the effectiveness, it's based on that particular series. So you wouldn't want to change going from Pfizer to Moderna, or vice versa, or J&J and getting a second shot or anything like that. So I would stick with the recommended administration schedule and protocol, because that's where we know the greatest effect. And I would be very careful that we sort of differentiate sort of the expected immune reaction from a true allergic reaction. That would be that's the other thing to kind of consider. And while we talk about receiving the injections at 3 weeks in one case or 4 weeks for the other, in fact, if you miss that date for whatever reason, you can come back and get the second injection. You don't have to start the series over.
Great, thank you. And I know we're coming up on time, so Kisa, do you have one last question that we'd like to ask? I've heard from so many of you. And we'll talk about that here as we get ready to close, but just want to see if there was one other question that we wanted to try to address.
Yeah, so I'll end it with this last question. And again, as we stated, if we did not get to your question, we will work with Dr. Tumlison and Dr. Greenfield to get answers to your questions and send that out. But a staff member did ask, is there any info on alternate delivery methods, such as nasal sprays, for those of us that do not like getting shots?
So I think we both may have a thought on this. I will say the vaccines that we currently have available are intramuscular, they're injections, okay? There are studies that are ongoing. Like I said, there are a number of vaccines that are being studied, but currently there's nothing available. Now, when we talk about intranasal, there are a couple of different ways that the immune system is stimulated, and the mucosal immunity is a unique immunity that has some, could have some benefit. But right now, what we have available, there are not any at this time.
Thank you for that. Again, we just want to thank everyone for submitting questions. We got so many wonderful questions, and I know many that we were not able to get to, but as Keisha said, we will work with Amy, our folks here, along with Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Tomlinson to get answers to those. Also want to make sure and just remind folks that we do have a couple clinic opportunities coming up. One, we're going to be having one here in the central office for those of you that are in the Little Rock area. We'll also be having one at our Warren Human Development Center. And again, that is open to not just staff that work at the Human Development Center, but also our staff who may be out there at county offices, working in the field. Excellent opportunity for folks, if you're not here within the Little Rock area, to go ahead and get vaccinated. And also just want to offer for folks, as you have a chance to kind of think about today's session, and again, really appreciate everyone who was able to participate. If there are things that would be helpful, we've tried different approaches in terms of meeting in small groups and trying to address specific issues that folks have had questions around, whether it's underlying health conditions or about age or fertility issues. We certainly would love to hear from folks if you think that would be helpful, whether that's here, again, in the central office area or out across the state. We'd love to hear from you and to be able to help think about if there's questions that you have or things that we could help answer that might help you better determine whether or not that this is the appropriate decision for you. And so if you will, just again, join me in thanking Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Tomlinson. We really, really do appreciate y'all's time and really just, the candor in speaking with us about where we are as a state, the progress we've made, but really the importance of continuing to get vaccinated and doing the things that we know in terms of wearing masks, social distancing, and washing our hands to hopefully help us stay safe. So,
Hey, and Dawn,
I'll turn it over to Amy.
hey, I was just gonna say, sorry, I'm not on camera. So I was just gonna say, for the vaccine clinic that's here tomorrow, there's no reason that you have to let us know beforehand. You can just show up. It's 9 to 1 o'clock. And if you didn't get it last time, you can get your first vaccine tomorrow as well. Sorry.
All right. Thank you, everyone.